In the mid-19th century, American exploration and gradual occupation of tribal homelands would change the country and its people forever. At first, only small parties of explorers, fur traders, and trappers arrived in the New West, but within a few decades, hordes of miners, farmers, and other settlers poured west, carrying them with disease, bigotry, and violence. The Oregon Trail is one of the most famous trails bringing new settlers to the West. Between 1803 and 1850, settlers and explorers came in swarms in search of the Manifest Destiny and the Discovery Doctrine. According to William J. Bauer, the Discovery Doctrine was defined as under established international law that newly arrived Europeans immediately and automatically acquired property rights in native lands and gained governmental, political, and commercial rights over the inhabitants without the knowledge nor the consent of the indigenous people. Thus, after discovery, American Indians could occupy the land, but they would never own the land, and it would become inevitable that Indian country would not remain solely for the American Indians. Therefore, the Oregon Trail was a route white settler used to move west in the hope of a better life and discover new lands. What would make settlers seek new life in America's West and start the journey from the civilized East to the uncivilized West? Many questions faced the settlers as they were planning their route to the West. Some Easterners wondered why anyone would take to the trail at all, most discouraged it just for the distance alone. The length of the Oregon Trail was 2,170 miles long and took about 4.5 months to travel. It started in Independence, Missouri, and extended to Oregon City, Oregon. In 1843, nearly 1,000 settlers traveled the trail, and by 1866, nearly 350,000 people moved westward by way of the Oregon Trail. Kathy Weiser points out, the expansion of the United States that approached upon Native American lands occurred faster when many policymakers had predicted with events such as the Mexican-American War in 1848, which placed new territories and tribes under federal jurisdiction. A government report in 1852 explained that many Californians believed destiny had awarded California to the Americans to develop, and that if the Indians interfered with progress, they should be pushed aside. By today's standards, the trip by covered wagon into the largely unexplored territory could not even be imagined. In 1843, Marcus Whitman was the first to lead a wagon train to the Great West. Many of the people who decided to move westward were farmers. Prices of land increased in the East, therefore farmers couldn't afford to stay. Many farmers sold what they had to buy wagons and oxen. A family had to have money to move west. Often they would transform their farm wagons into covered wagons, or even build wagons to make sure they were built to handle the trip. These same people didn't own weapons or even know they had to drive oxen with a wagon train. Many of the farmers also had families that they would take all of the way to Oregon in a covered wagon. The covered wagon was 4.5 feet wide and 14 feet long by most standards. They carried as much as 2,000 pounds in the wagons. Families didn't have much room for comfort or belongings, and once they set out of Independence, Missouri, they were entering the great American desert. They would have to cross 3 treacherous mountain ranges and 4 rivers, but one of the greatest challenges would not be landforms, but disease such as measles and smallpox. 1 out of 10 would not survive the trip. Most of the deaths resulted from carelessness, accidental gunshots, or children falling under the wheels of the wagon. The Oregon Trail has also been called the world's largest graveyard. There were shallow graves about every 80 yards, and while giving them a ceremony, it was often brief so they could continue their journey to the west. The Great Migration took place in the late spring or early summer, so they would make the 4 to 5 month trip before winter came. The summer months were hot and dry. The sun beat down every day with no trees in sight often brought boredom. The sounds of the covered wagon was deafening with the pots and pans clicking and the sound of the oxen or horses on the trail. Many firsts were discovered on the trail, such as buffalo and the American Indians. The American Indians would watch the wagon trails and livestock frighten the buffalo, destroy the grass along the route, and follow the water holes. This migration changed the Indians' conditions immediately. Nichols points out. Instead of having only occasional meetings with settlers, they encountered them repeatedly, as thousands of pioneers headed west to the fertile Oregon country in California. The buffalo, an animal the Indians believed to be sacred, proved to be very useful for the travelers. The meat was tough, but they provided essentials and they were plentiful. Even the buffalo chips could be used to fuel fire in the evenings. The buffalo could also be dangerous and cause much destruction when stampeding. In present-day Nebraska and Wyoming, the banks of the wide and shallow Platte and North Platte rivers provided a hospital westbound corridor for the travelers for the next 600 miles. Fort Laramie was the last place to stop and load up on supplies before the Rocky Mountains and the point of no return. Climbing steadily towards the Continental Divide along the Sweetwater River, they usually covered about 15 to 20 miles per day. Independence Rock was also a landmark because they would need to reach Independence Rock by July 4th, to be sure to reach Oregon before the snow came. Almost without realizing it, they next entered and crossed 7,412-foot-high South Pass, the broad and gently sloping valley that provided a gateway through the Rockies and made the whole journey possible. Near the end of the trip, they would have to make the decision to either cross the Columbia River or go over the rugged Cascade Mountains to reach Willamette Valley, their destination. The expansion west had a major impact on America and forced American Indians on compressed lands. Due to the advent of the Oregon Trail and the intrusion of the white settlers, American Indian way of life would never be the same, and to this day it is still a struggle to maintain the cultural beliefs held by their ancestors.